it's really nice to have a chance to have a conversation with you, particularly since I'm going to put you in an area in which you may be less comfortable than you usually are, because I really want to talk to you about your new novel, Poisoned Justice. But a big, broad question. When you think of contemporary crime writers, do you have other models that you think are having their characters ask questions about America in the same way that you're having Riley do?
Maybe. I mean, I really did read deeply and watched a lot of noir films.
A lot of Humphrey Bogart.
A lot of Humphrey Bogart and a lot of, you know, you look back at I mean, think about Double Indemnity, right? And so there's a character. And so one of the things that comes out of that early noir following World War II is this realization that the world is much more morally complex than we had thought. That good guys don't always win, bad guys don't always lose, and it's not always easy to figure out who the good guy and the bad guy is.
You're somebody who's written in a lot of genres and done a lot of different kinds of work, and you're highly aware of changes in science, you're aware of changes in philosophy and culture. So why this? Why confidently go into the long narrative form in this digital age?
There's a great quote from Richard Carney, a philosopher, right, who said that stories are more important than food. We eat in order to live, but we live in order to tell stories. And you know, in my experience with aging parent and with aging relatives and whatnot, when you lose your story, you lose your identity. I mean, that's what, in a sense, dementia is. And so the importance of story to us as individuals and as a culture and a society cannot be overstated. And so for me, fiction, you know, we could say the notion that it's just fiction is sort of incomprehensible.
Well, for me, fiction offers the greatest freedom to address the kinds of questions you're talking about. It's not that nonfiction can't. I think nonfiction does a really nice job, but I think it's in fiction where you can see a more dynamic approach, because it's not ask and answer, it's explore and discover.
Nonfiction, to be readable, has to have narrative. There has to be a story somehow, right? Otherwise it kind of becomes pedantic. And it's funny because there's a lot of evidence now that shows that in lectures, right, when faculty are lecturing, right, and we embed information in story, it's understood and it's retained far more effectively than if it's just laid out there in a naked form.
Well, of course I'm going to agree with you because I'm a fiction writer, but I'm also married to a trial lawyer who would say that there is no doubt that he or she who tells the best story to the jury wins the day. In exactly the way you're talking about, because you can assemble a lot of information if you can gather it around points of a narrative arc.
Well, you know, and then there's a fellow over in the law school who teaches legal writing and especially appellate cases. And in appellate cases are interesting because both sides have the same evidence, right? So
but he or she who tells the best
it's
story.
all about storytelling, right?
There are lots of different ways to write novels, and for me, each novel I've written has involved a different process. Your way of approaching it sounds wonderful and fantastic, and obviously really fruitful for you. But I'm familiar with your scientific work. You're a much published scientist as well as a much published essayist and scientific writer. But it sounds like you use some of your own strengths to approach this very different project.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just marvel at writers who say, you know, they have an idea about a character in the beginning of a story and they just start writing. For me, that's just inconceivable I mean, it's marvelous, right? I envy it, but I have no idea what that would be like. Maybe I understand it a little bit at the chapter level or maybe at the scene level, right? But at the book level, I can't imagine exactly what that would feel like. Yeah, maybe it's that analytic, scientific control structure thing. And I actually approach teaching the same way in many ways, right? I tend to go in to lectures with a very clear outline, but that, for me, that's how I get freedom in the moment, is by having done that preparation before getting there.
And I probably am a little bit different in that way, but I cut my teeth as a short story writer, so I do have outlines, but it tends to be bullet points, not sort of fully sketched out chapters, whether I'm teaching or whether I'm lecturing. So it's interesting. I think we all just do different things with language. My old mentor, George Garrett, said that every novel project was very different, and everything you learned from the previous project you would have to set aside to work on a new project. And I found that to be very true. But I've never written crime fiction, and I've never worked on a series. And I wonder, I mean, I think there are at least 3 Riley novels. I don't know how many are done so far. But if the planning and structure is more relevant to something like crime fiction, where your audience is expecting a really strong plot, than it might be in some other genres. And you also, for instance, have been a great writer of what I'll call meditations, which is closer to prayer than a crime novel, I think.
Yeah, I think very much so. And I think the crime novel does. I mean, one of the ways that's kind of fun is that there are certain norms, right? And having done lots of reading, you sort of absorb what those are, right? And so there's a length norm, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're looking at 90 to 110,000 words. So you know you've got that constraint. You know it's going to be plot driven, but you know that people return to crime novels not because of plots, but because of characters. Right, and it's the character that they fall in love with, right? And without a strong character, the best plot falls flat. And so I like the notion of having this strong character, which is very typical in mystery, right?
It is true. There are some people who've written against that norm, right, to try
Fair
to
enough.
see
Right.
If they can sort of erase or flatten the so-called protagonist. There are also some people who've worked really well with very unpleasant characters as their protagonists in an attempt to sort of create an interesting tension in the reader. But that's not the case with Riley. So let's talk about him a little bit. He's in San Francisco in the 70s. He's a cop who's been drummed out of the force. And he's running an extermination business. I'll use that phrase, although he and his team like to call themselves lots of other things, but they take care of pests and insects.
A good exterminator has a lot in common with a good assassin. You know your target, you understand it, you know its behavior, you know its time, you know its place, and you do your work by picking the right weapon at the right time and doing the least amount of damage to bystanders.
Mm-hmm. Well, and he's in San Francisco roughly the same time that Dirty Harry is in San Francisco in those seminal moments. Why do something set in the 1970s in crime fiction now, as opposed to, say, San Francisco in the aughts or the 2010s?
San Francisco was the city that my mother loved. I grew up in Albuquerque, and so we went to San Francisco probably 3 times when I was between the ages of, say, 10 and 18, right? And that was from the late 60s to the late 70s. So I was in San Francisco exactly when this book is taking place. And then I honeymooned in 1982.
Oh, okay.
Wait, I have my prop. Yeah. So here, as ridiculous as this is, right? So 1982, Nan and I are in San Francisco, right? And here's this, chalk street artist drawing of us. So that time is, that time is between where the book, the next one, which is about 80% done, is taking place in the very early 80s. I've got vivid memories, sort of these snapshot memories and whatnot. And a lot of noir mystery or noir-ish mystery is driven by an urban setting. Mm-hmm. And I wanted him to be an exterminator, right? Because you should write about something that you know about that. And so the idea of including pesticides and pests and the relationship we have to the pest. There's one point where Riley compares himself as a former detective to an exterminator, right? And he says it's nothing personal, right? Some people are sociopaths and some insects are pests. My job is to take care of that.
That's what Riley has that no other detective has, right? He understands the world of insects and pests, and has the resources but also the knowledge to solve a particular kind of crime, mm-hmm. As opposed to being a forensics, a bullet person or a fingerprint person or a profiler of serial killers, which is a famous sort of
right.
trope. For me, it really works. I was not in San Francisco in the 70s, but it's a city you can always romanticize sort of urbanscapes mm-hmm. In the past, and that works nicely. You also get to play off that California dynamic of how the South is different from the North. how the culture in Berkeley is perhaps different from culture elsewhere in the Bay. And you're catching a lot of really interesting waves, not least among them the way we think about environment and poison, right? So to me, you get to play off a lot of the cop tropes, but you also get to sort of signal some changes in American culture. We see glimpses of gay culture. We see more than glimpses of feminism. We see glimpses of big changes in academic culture. And I don't want to get too far off, but I do think you use this poison justice as an occasion to operate in the field of academic satire, which I know must please you greatly, having been a professor for 30 plus years. Yeah. And I'm wondering if Riley's going to stay away from campuses in the future, or whether he's going to continue to visit them and look into their contradictions, and also the idea that mild-mannered professors could be tricky criminals, which I do like, by the way.
Being able to say Riley in the 70s goes onto the Berkeley campus, right? There's all kinds of things that sort of are entailed there, right? The protest movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, the anti-war movement, and as you point out, the environmental movement, which I think is much stronger on the West Coast at that time than it is the East Coast.
So you're the author behind Riley. So you're asking questions of meaning. You're putting him in social situations. So how do you think about managing that?
I don't know how you write a main character who doesn't have elements of oneself, right?
Good question.
And so I find myself in my mid-50s, right, in the middle of this society and culture with young students in our MFA program and whatnot, trying to figure out what the hell's going on. What is this cultural landscape?
That makes this book relevant then, to go back to a question I asked a little while ago, though it's set 40-some years in the past.
Right.
Because there are questions that Riley asks, or questions that are asked of Riley, that you would say resonate right up to 2016 and beyond.
Well, in a sense, right? I mean, not this is highest literature, right? But in a sense, right? What literature does is it taps into the perennial questions, right? And one of the perennial questions is, as we mature, as we age, right? How do we deal with change, especially social change, political change, right? Because it's not as it was, right? And we want to think that the way we understood the world when we were in our 20s or 30s was somehow the right way, or a stable way, or a predictable way. Or at least you understood it, as does Riley, as does me. But now we're confronted with Ferguson, we're confronted with Black Lives Matter, we're confronted with LGBT issues in different ways than we have been in the past.
Let's talk about the responsibility of artists and philosophers if we're in a really big period of cultural change, akin to the mid-60s to the mid-70s. So let's take that as the premise. Some would say, Jeff, what are you doing? That's pretty frivolous. A detective novel? You should be writing tracts or speeches, or you should be trying to reach a larger audience in a different way. You have a different moral duty than to mess around with somebody like Riley. What's your response to that? What kind of responsibility do we as writers have to meaning and to social justice?
Well, I think we do. I think we do, especially we as writers who are on the public dole, right?
Wow. Okay.
Well,
right. No, it's great.
I'm being paid by the people of Wyoming, right? And to me, and I'm part of a tenure system, right? To me, that entails tremendous social and moral obligations. Right? Because, and I think the greatest obligation I have in that context is a duty to tell the truth. Right? I think that's why we have a tenure system, is to protect truth tellers. And I've done some of that in my nonfiction. The book that's coming out in March is certainly going to be, behind the carbon curtain is that way. But I think the important truths are also can be told, don't have to be told in this time, in this place, in the form of the essay or the expose. And sometimes, Ted Gupp, who I had a workshop with years and years and years ago, said, he had this notion that the heavier the message, the softer the voice.
I agree with that. I like that very much. And it's one of the things that I'm concerned with, and one of the things I'm really trying to work with students because is that fiction is more powerful if it's nuanced and it contains contradictions.
Right.
If you want to write a blog post, please do so. And there are many effective, important blog posts. There are also essays that come in lots of tones and lots of shapes. But fiction is useful for a lot of things, but it's most useful, I think, for embodying contradictions and for providing a way of looking at complex issues in a complex manner. So that if you're incredibly angry about a single issue or a single facet of injustice, fiction can be a difficult form for you to tackle. I don't want to take that totally off the board, because people like Solzhenitsyn and others have done a lot of ranting and screed producing within important work.
Right.
But I think about Kafka, whom we continue to read in times of all kinds of, whether social change or not, because his way of thinking about fable, his way of thinking about government power has become really timeless now, in a way that a blog post is not. So going back and looking at all the tools for storytelling and putting those in front of you and learning what they are as a young writer, it seems to me important, even if you want to fly some kind of political flag.
I think that's right, and I think, so that's basically how I guess I would justify the Riley novels, right, is that it's kind of a, how should I put this? It's a gentle form. We don't feel threatened by the noir mystery. We don't feel threatened by the crime. We kind of know, right?
We're going to get an answer at the end?
It's inviting.
Is that what we know? Okay.
Well, it's inviting, right? And so you can ask some hard questions, right? You know, is Stoicism the right approach to life? Do we detach ourselves from our actions, right? What's the role of the existentialist today, right? Who rejects the norms and standards of society? Can we operate within our own self-created sphere of justice? And are we accountable when we do that, right? You know, those are big questions. And what Riley, for me, is addressing in the 70s in San Francisco are really these perennial questions that are now returning today. But if I wrote this in today's San Francisco, you know, with a white on black police killing, right, with the particulars of the LGBT community at this time, to me, there's a kind of intensity, a kind of off-puttingness, a sense of, well, who are you to be saying? But if we back it up 30 or 40 years, we can ask those same questions that continue today, right? What is the relationship between the genders, right? What are the genders, right? What is the relationship among the races? What is the relationship among wealth and poverty? How should we be treating the environment? Those questions are not going to go away, but to ask them in a softer voice, one way of doing that is to turn back the clock so that the stakes are not so immediate, the stakes are not so high.
But you're still highlighting what I think is the most important thing in fiction, as a writer and a reader, which is putting a character in a position where he or she has to make a choice.
Right.
Good, and maybe there are no good choices, but by putting some sort of pressure, putting them in some sort of environment where they have to choose one course of action over another, is to me at the essence of our work. And so I think I would say this is a really exciting time to be a writer of anything. I would argue it's a triply exciting time to be a fiction writer in America because of exactly the forces that you're sensing and that you begin to address in this novel.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right. And this question of choice, right? And I tell students when I've taught ethics classes, right? If you think ethics is about choosing between good and evil, right? Then you're a psychopath and I can't help you, right? You choose the good, right? Ethics is about choosing between evils or between goods. That's where it's complicated, right? Is there is no good answer, but you can't not, to not answer is to answer as well.
Right, you can't not act, or you could.
But that is an action. You've made the choice to let it be, and so, no, there's no escape.
I think that's really wonderfully articulated, Jeff. And for me, you haven't tried this yet, maybe you will. Short fiction still accords one the opportunity to really put that pressure on characters and settings, and also on the reader to sort of say, I'm not going to make you comfortable. I'm not going to ask it in a soft voice. I'm going to lure you in. And I agree with you, I still lure in with character, but other writers invest in plot, setting, even style. as ways. But character is still the way. But then to kind of present that choice or no choice pretty quickly. And I may not provide the answers about the aftermath to my readers in the way that you do in Poison Justice, and the way that a lot of novelists do.
Right.
So you can unsettle readers in 10 or 15 minutes, I think, in short fiction. It may be that people don't like to read short fiction as much as novels because it's not as comfortable. And I have to think about that too. But maybe, have you ever tried short stories? Will you think you'll do that next? Or are you addicted to novelizing right now?
No, I steadfastly refuse to say what I will and won't do, right? Because when I started in this thing, I certainly didn't anticipate writing a novel.
I didn't anticipate you writing a novel either. I'll just say that.
And so, why would I close a door? I mean, that would be so inconsistent with what we've cultivated in our program at the University of Wyoming, right? We don't close doors. It's a kind of playful. If you're not taking risks.
Oh, I agree.
What the heck are you doing?
So if we're not making ourselves uncomfortable as writers and artists, it doesn't matter whether we're teaching or not. We need to be making ourselves uncomfortable. And I actually am not even sure how I would define the genre of crime fiction anymore, or any kind of genre anymore. But I do like asking folks like you, what do you think you're doing moving into new territory in middle age? If you didn't, you'd be aesthetically numbed,
right?
But you'd be comfortable, and we should never be too comfortable.
Was it Pink Floyd's lyric, comfortably numb?
Comfortably numb. I almost said that.
Yeah, I heard that coming.
Just one last question. When you were working with Riley, or how have your expectations of him changed as a major character now that you've been living with him with a couple of 3 years? Because for me, I think I know a character, and at the end I don't, and that's wonderful. But you're going to write about him for a long time. How has he changed as you've lived with him?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I've got the second book I'm about 3/4 of the way in, and one of the things that I'm discovering in the second book that doesn't appear in the first book is what Riley's romantic life might be like, right? And so there's a love story that happens in the second book, but it's a difficult one for him as well. Because
I was going to say good luck, because I'm not sure.
He's not particularly lovable.
No, but I think he's also going to be hard to keep on task in that way.
And so he's been surprising there. But there's a tenderness to him in his relationship with Tommy and his mother. Mm-hmm. But that's a different kind of relationship than he would have in a romantic relationship. So trying to figure out the way in which Riley would love in a romantic sense has been really interesting.
That sounds wonderful, because I am going to argue that love is very difficult to write about. I actually think romantic love is the easier form of love to write about in some ways, but what you've done in this first book is plant the seeds with Riley's mother and with Tommy, that he is a complex emotional character, and one that you might have success writing about for quite a while. So thanks so much, Jeff.
Well, thank you,
I think
Alyson.
it's about time for us to wrap up our conversation, but it's been a real pleasure. Good luck with your next novel.
Thanks.